Hey, what's going on, gang? Nate on the Stone here. Welcome back to my channel and to another edition of The Rolling Stone. It has been one of those weeks where everything has been happening all at once. And we're going to talk about some of those things in this edition of The Rolling Stone. Not all of them, however. Some stories, there's a lot to plumb in them, so I thought that to do them justice, I would need to put them in a standalone regular On the Stone video. But like always, we are going to do our best. We are going to look at some of the big things that happened this week and talk about them. And the first thing, of course, that we have to talk about, because everyone and their grandmother is talking about it, is the Derek Chauvin trial, which is over and done with until, of course, an appeal is made, because, of course, in the modern American legal system, that's just what you do. And perhaps to the surprise of no one, the jury in Derek Chauvin's trial found him guilty. But what was also surprising is that they didn't just find him guilty of maybe third-degree murder and or manslaughter. No, they found him guilty on charges of second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and manslaughter. And it took them less than 24 hours to actually come back with a full house, as it were, of guilty verdicts. And what's interesting about this is that it raises the question if justice was actually done or not. Now, according to the left, of course, justice absolutely was done. U.S. News had a story out about the current occupant of the White House, of course, had to be put in front of a podium and a microphone and go on about how this was a great day. But he warned that this is only the first step in the long march towards justice. Now, isn't that interesting? Joe Biden said that Derek Chauvin's full house of guilty verdicts is only the first step in the long road to justice. You would have thought that, with the conclusion of the trial, then that would have been the end of it. We could all kind of hope or pray that this could be put behind us and that things could kind of go back to quote-unquote normal, because certainly, I mean, a lot of the demands of BLM had been met, right? George Floyd's death, caught on videotape, has propelled a lot of police departments to reform. They've caused local politicians to make pretty speeches and to even demand change. Minneapolis even, in fact, has started to abolish its police department by drastically underfunding it, which we talked about in a previous Rolling Stone. But no, this is only the first step in the long road to justice, per Joe Biden, per the current holder of the title of vice president as well. In fact, the Washington Post had a story where Biden actually used the opportunity to talk about Derek Chauvin's conviction as a time to also slam systematic racism again. Now, that in and of itself, too, gang, is interesting, because you would have thought that if anything would have proven that systematic racism doesn't exist anymore in the country, or if it did exist prior to May 2020, that it is now on the way out. It should have been Derek Chauvin's conviction. Here we had a former police officer, Derek Chauvin, whom the left said was absolutely a racist white supremacist. Okay? Let's just run with that premise. They put him on trial for the death of a black man, George Floyd, and the jury finds him guilty, like I said, of third-degree murder, second-degree murder, and manslaughter. So if systematic racism is actually real, then how was the jury actually even able to convict Chauvin of all those charges? Even more to the point, why is the city of Minneapolis still standing? If the foundation of American society is systematic racism, and if the country is full up to the gills of white racists, wouldn't you have thought that entire swarms of racists would have come from the Mason-Dixie line and just devoured Minneapolis, wouldn't you think that not a stone would be standing left in that formerly good, great city? Choose the adjective of your choice there. Wouldn't you have thought that? Of course, neither of those things happened. It's a very interesting contradiction in terms, but it's a contradiction that we're not even allowed to express. Because, of course, if you express that, you are a white supremacist yourself, which then leads me to the second point, which is, this is going to be considered blasphemous, I know, but hey, we'll go with the punches. It leads to the question of how much the jury's 3 convictions, its full house of guilty verdicts, how much of that is justice and how much of that is intimidation. I was listening on YouTube to a segment of the Daily Wire's Backstage show, and the wunderkind himself, Ben Shapiro, which you guys know I'm no huge fan of, but he is trained in the law, so this case was right up his alley. And Shapiro was explaining to the rest of the crew, as it were, Walsh, Clavin, Owens, and what's the other guy's name, their producer? Boring, I think, Jeremy Boring. But he was saying that it was surprising because second and third degree murder should be a little harder to prove. He was saying especially with the evidence that the jury had to work with, because you have to be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that there was intent to actually kill. And in Shapiro's estimation, the prosecution had not proven that. They had not offered evidence that would have swayed the jury to that interpretation beyond a reasonable doubt. Shapiro said he wouldn't have been surprised at all if Chauvin had been convicted on the charge of manslaughter, but the other 2 charges, second and third degree murder, that was a little suspicious. And indeed it is a little suspicious, of course, because you had other examples of intimidation happening right there in the city. The big one, of course, was Maxine Waters, who on Saturday, April 17th, so this was before the jury was sequestered, came to Minneapolis and told a crowd that they were looking for a guilty verdict, and that if they did not get that guilty verdict, then they would actually have to become even more confrontational with the police. CNN actually had an entire op-ed, because what happened was the judge in Derek Chauvin's case actually from the bench slapped Maxine's wrist a little bit, said, you know, her antics on Saturday, that actually might cause a mistrial, because then again, you know, the defense for Chauvin will say, well, this swayed the jury because we've just gone through, you know, over half a year, going on a whole year now, of riots, burnings, lootings in Minneapolis. And when she says we have to become even more confrontational, people are going to be afraid. People are going to interpret that as, oh, more lootings, more burnings, more of the anarchy that we've seen since last May. We don't want that. Convict him, convict him, convict him. He is going to be our sacrificial lamb upon which we hope the BLM mob will be appeased. And CNN ran an entire op-ed actually saying that this judge was talking out of his hat. Of course, this isn't what Maxine Waters meant. Maxine Waters had a history of non-violent civil disobedience that was non-violent, which is, of course, within everyone's constitutional rights now. But the thing is, it's the guy, it was that CNN op-ed which was talking through its hat. Because no one can say that after almost an entire year of anarchy, not just in Minneapolis, but in all great American cities, great in the sense of big, not great in the sense of imposing, awe-inspiring, or good anymore, that in all great American cities, this had been happening as well. Okay? Even if Waters hadn't meant for her words to be interpreted that way, even if she only meant by become more confrontational, she meant more non-violent civil disobedience, odds are most people weren't going to interpret her words like that. And Maxine Waters, she is actually only one example of intimidation, but she's the big fire. She was sucking the oxygen out of the room, and everyone was talking about Maxine Waters simply because she was a congresswoman and she had said that we needed to become more confrontational. But there were other examples, gang. For example, from ABC 7 News, Santa Rosa pig blood vandalism tied to defense witness in Chauvin trial, police say. So a house in Santa Rosa, California was vandalized. Vandals actually splattered blood across the front of the house, and then they tossed a decapitated pig's head onto the front porch. Why? Because that house used to be owned by one of the jurors on Derek Chauvin's trial. Okay, it used to belong to a former Santa Rosa police officer, Barry Brode, who testified on behalf of the defense, saying Chauvin was justified in pinning George Floyd to the ground. So because Barry Brode testified in defense of Chauvin, a house that he no longer owns in Santa Rosa was vandalized in Godfather style. Here's another example as well. Chauvin's defense attorney was a guy named Eric C. Nelson, but Minneapolis is a big place, and Eric Nelson turns out to be a very common name. And so an Eric J. Nelson, who has practiced exclusively family law since 1996 in Minneapolis, started to receive death threats from people who assumed that he was the defense attorney for Eric Chauvin. And one of those death threats was emailed to him by a guy named John Sparrow, S-P-A-R-O, who said the usual spiel: you're a racist, you're a white supremacist, that's the only reason why you would defend another white supremacist, Derek Chauvin, that little thing about the Constitution guaranteeing that people be represented in courts of law. Well, we can just do away with that. Remember, the Constitution is also a relic of white supremacy and racial discrimination, etc., etc. And Sparrow ended his letter with this little tidbit: there are going to be people looking for you. Now, like I said, this was happening before the jury was even sequestered, so I am sure that they were hearing about this. So it's entirely possible that they were intimidated. They're like, we don't want our house vandalized with a pig's head, which is a pretty clear message. Let me just say, we don't want to start getting death threats. You never know when one of them is actually going to be written in all seriousness. Best to just convict Chauvin and hope that the mob will be appeased. Now the big picture of all of this, gang, is that it places us in a very precarious position, because now we have entered into a state that is now being normalized by the current occupants of the White House, and, the professed president and vice president of the United States. This is all being normalized. And what's being normalized is this idea that intimidation works. You can intimidate a jury. You can intimidate public officials to get the results that you want. Justice be hanged. And it places us in the precarious position because we personally no longer have a personal guarantee that if we are dragged before a court of law, we will actually receive justice. Whoever is deciding our trial, whether it's a judge, whether it's a jury, whatever, they may decide to make us a sacrificial lamb, because who knows what we will have been involved in? Who even knows? You're white. Maybe you're going to be found guilty simply to balance out the racial scales. Remember, Ibram Kendi says that the only way to make up for the racism of the past is racism now. Just racism against people of lighter skin color instead of racism against people with darker skin color. But even more to the point, I believe that I have had the occasion to quote Alexander Hamilton here before, where he said that the end of society is justice. That is the end goal of every single society. That is its telos towards that which it is directed. Well, when justice is wiped off the books, if we're no longer actually interested in justice, and we're not because, again, intimidation more than likely is being normalized in this case, then what exactly do we even have? Do we even have a society? Yeah, you might answer yes or no on that. Do you have a good society? Now, that one is a definite no. And if you don't live in a good society, then what's even the point of staying in society? Remember, society, one of the reasons is so that we can attain justice, because to use the very charged phrase, state of nature, the only justice you can get is the rule of the stronger. Whoever, the biggest guy with the biggest club gets to decide what justice is. And it's always going to benefit him. You can bet your bottom dollar on that. Society is the way to actually circumvent that, so that we can know right from wrong, moral from immoral, and we have laws to actually allow that people are equal in the eyes of the law. We are legally equal. So just because you happen to be the biggest guy with the biggest club on the block, that doesn't mean that you automatically get your way if you've wronged me. That's one of the primary reasons why societies exist and why they maintained, so that everyone can have justice when they need it. With that gone, I will repeat the question, what's really the point? What's really the point? That is story number one.